just a few questions. One question I'd like to ask you as follow on to that amazing presentation is you recently wrote an article on your blog titled "The Double-Edged Sword of Digital Health," the title of your article. You said that most digital health programs have lower effectiveness when deployed in the real world because digital health's greatest strength, accessibility, also inevitably lowers engagement rates. Could you share with us how so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the funny thing is, when I was running behavioral diabetes management programs in VA hospitals, the biggest challenge that I had was just getting patients to come to treatment every week, right? They literally have to drive their car to the hospital every week. And that was the biggest barrier for compliance. And so the nice thing about technology is we said, okay, let's switch that paradigm around and let's bring treatment to patients, right? They can do it in the convenience of their own home, they can do it on their smartphone, they can do it on their computers, which basically opened the intervention to a lot more people. The thing that I think nobody really realized and we found is the funny thing about erecting barriers is that it basically serves as a pre-screener for motivation, right? Obviously you want to make your intervention as accessible to as many people as possible. But one of the things that I always try to explain is that the difference between medicine and psychology is that in medicine, the physician is the agent of change, right? The patient comes in, says, hey doc, I got a problem. The doctor's like, I have a pill or a procedure that can fix you, right? But as a psychologist, if the patient comes to me, I always tell people, I can't change you. I can only give you the knowledge, the skills, and the resources for you to change yourself, right? And so we actually don't, behavior change is not something you do to anyone. They have to kind of meet the person where they're at. And so the challenge with technology is when you make things ultra accessible, where literally in 15 minutes while sitting in their living room, they can sign up for a program, is that person may not be totally ready to change, right? They may realize that it's sort of in that contemplative stage of change that it would be beneficial for them, but they may not be ready to commit 5 hours a week or wake up, as I mentioned, 7:30 in the morning to go to the gym. But someone who is already driving to a hospital is probably farther along that motivational spectrum. So I think the challenge with digital health interventions is how do we balance that accessibility, but making sure that the right people are doing the intervention who actually have the motivation and can actually take advantage of it. And I think one thing that I haven't seen, and if someone wants to start a billion-dollar company, this is it, is how do you effectively use data to predict who would be a good candidate for a behavioral treatment. I think there's a lot of potential actually in using data science in doing that. We actually would try using, for instance, questionnaire data. There's like readiness to change questionnaires and say, you know, are you ready to change? Are you motivated to change? Are you confident that you'll change? And you know, guess what happens at the beginning of a program? People always say, yes, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10, I'm super ready. And of course they're not, right? They're just riding that initial wave of motivation. But there's a lot of predictors in terms of personality characteristics like conscientiousness. You can look at behavioral patterns of behavior that people are engaging in on social networks and use that to say, hey, if I put someone in this behavior change program, how likely are they to actually comply with it, take advantage of it, and benefit from it? And if you can do that, then the ROI of your intervention is going to be much, much higher, and you can charge more for it, and payers are going to be much more likely to pay for it. Because the worst thing you have is patients who sign up for your program and drop out, right? Nobody's happy. The patient's not happy, you're not happy, the payer's not happy.
Interesting, that makes sense. Thank you. Another question we have for you is, in the books like Nudge and the Power of Habit, which I know you mentioned, the authors discuss the power of social influencers, which are said to be effective in promoting healthy behaviors. How might entrepreneurs today take this research on social influencers and apply this behavior to change, to behavior change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we tried to do this at Amada, but basically using peer social influence, right? So we were trying to put people on level playing fields and use that to basically get people to look at people that might be in a group and say, hey, if she can do it, I can do it too. But I think the interesting thing is, you know, in the era of social media, you're seeing the whole rise of the influencer movement, where you have these basically internet celebrities, and they leverage their brands very powerfully, right? They can sell or promote their brands, sell products with it. But I think it's interesting, particularly if you're on Instagram, you see a lot of these health and fitness influencers, and they're also, you know, leveraging their brands to get people to change too. And so I think there's actually a lot of potential there in terms of, especially if you're focused more on the consumer side, of how do you sort of establish followership, because celebrity is very influential. And people, if you're sort of like whether it's a Dr. Oz sort of academic celebrity or sort of like a fitness celebrity, you can engage with your users in a way that you never could before, where, if it's like a TV personality, you'll never talk to that person. But you see sort of these micro-influencers rising up who have sort of maybe less than sort of 10 to 50,000 followers, and they communicate with their users on a regular basis, right? So like a great example of this is a guy named Possible Pat, a very obese guy, transformed himself, lost a ton of weight, now is like a personal trainer, uses his Instagram to motivate people, but like literally like comments and engages with his users. And so the feedback and the connection that he has with this community is very powerful. And I think using the sort of that influencer aspect to drive behavior change is very powerful, because people always do want to see positive examples of change, and people do learn through modeling, and we know that from social psychology. And so if people can sort of show that it is possible, it can make a big influence on them as well.
Great, thank you. One of the other interesting topics that were discussed in the book, The Power of Habit, was the power of free will. So would you take a moment to elaborate on this, and how should entrepreneurs go about helping motivate someone to have the will to change their habits?
Yeah, my default gut reaction answer is you shouldn't. I mean, I think actually willpower is overrated. I think, as I mentioned at sort of the beginning of my talk, trying to increase someone's motivation. I mean, there are techniques to do so. As I mentioned, there is motivational interviewing, but motivational interviewing, when you're doing it in a clinical setting, usually takes a few sessions. You kind of have to meet people where they're at, and you can only sort of move someone who's at like a 1 out of 10, maybe like a 5 out of 10. Obviously, education using these techniques can be helpful, but I think what's more effective is to use an increase in motivation at the right time point, right? You're not going to motivate someone and sustain that motivation for years. What I think you can do, though, is to motivate people at the right time to basically sign up for your program or engage in a behavior that has long-term consequences, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. You show a very inspirational, motivational video that says, hey, here's our app, here's our product, and this is why you should sign up. It may boost their motivation for 5 minutes, but that's all you need to get them to basically put in their information and make an account, right? And so you're leveraging that. The other example of that is people who get really motivated around January 1st, sign up for a gym membership, and maybe the compliance with that isn't so great, but sometimes if you're signing up for a 2-year gym membership, that like 5 days of motivation has long-term consequences. And so sometimes people actually do end up going to the gym more often because they basically prepaid for the whole thing, or they signed up for a bunch of personal training sessions, and that makes it longer term. So I think if you leverage motivation in a way that has long-term consequences, which is usually around signing up for something that's not easily reversible, then even though it's sort of a transient phenomenon, it can have longer-term implications.
Great, thank you. And last question. What is your vision for digital health in the next 5 to 15 years?
Oh man, big question. Ask the audience that. One of the things that I've seen is, I think in the generations of companies, my last company came out of the first class of Rock Health, and we've seen sort of subsequent classes come up. I think they sort of represent what I call digital health 1.0, in that a lot of the companies were basically translations of existing diagnostics or therapeutics to an online setting, right? You take a clinical trial like the DPP, or you take an evidence-based treatment like CBT, and then you basically just digitize it. You create an online version of it that's even more accessible. But it's not a fundamental innovation or transformation of the technology, right? It's more about making that intervention accessible to a wider number of people. Online DPP is not more effective than in-person DPP. It's comparably effective, right? What I think is going to happen in Digital Health 2.0 is it's going to be less translations of in-person treatments and more sort of what I call digitally native treatments that take advantage of fundamental advances in computer science or electrical engineering to literally create treatments that look nothing like what we do now, right? So for instance, like the whole psychotherapy model of like you come for an hour a week and you see your therapist is largely a function of that's probably the most reasonable expectation that you can get someone to drive and see you for an hour a week, right? But what if it wasn't an hour session, and that's a function of how we bill through our insurance system, where it's an always on thing, maybe there's sort of micro points of contact where it's all throughout the week, and doesn't look anything like the way that we engage today. So I think these sort of fundamentally innovative treatments that were designed specifically for digital platforms are going to be the next wave of technologies that especially use AI, that use ML as sort of the underpinning of what they're doing.
That's great. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.